Welcome everybody to our fourth instalment of the Cry for Hope in Lent series that we're running. Please could I just ask that you just stay on mute for a moment if you're joining the call, and that will give us a chance to introduce the evening and get everything started. My name's Charlotte Marshall. I'm the advocacy worker for Sabeel-Kairos, and I'm going to be guiding you through our Lent session tonight. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel in the week, we're really glad that you are, and it's been wonderful to see so many of you engaging in that way. Tonight, our theme is looking at whether you can follow the gospel and support the oppression of the Palestinian people, which of course we're probably going to be hearing a resounding no to from our two wonderful speakers, who are going to just be looking a bit about some of the biblical justice issues. What does it say in the Bible about how we support the oppressed, and how that's sometimes a particular challenge for the context of Israel and Palestine. Our two speakers tonight are the wonderful Mark Braverman, who I can actually see on my screen at the moment, but I assume that hopefully you're all seeing me, and also Ulrich Duchrow. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction. I'm sure many of you know them already. I'll start with Mark. Mark's roots are in the Holy Land. His grandfather was a fifth-generation Palestinian Jew who was born in Jerusalem but moved to the United States as a young man. Mark grew up in the United States in the Jewish tradition, studying the Bible, Hebrew literature, and Jewish history. In 2006, he went back to the Holy Land, and what he encountered there transformed his whole view of the conflict. He met a lot of peace activists and civil society leaders from Muslim, Christian, and Jewish groups. And he found himself and his faith at conflict with what he saw with Palestinians living under occupation. Since then, Mark has devoted himself full-time to challenging the Israeli occupation and to campaigning for change. He's been a founder of a number of organizations to help this, including the Friends of the Tent of Nations in North America, a board member of Friends of Sabeel North America, and also currently, and for the last few years, the executive director for Kairos USA. So we're delighted to have Mark with us. I know he's a familiar name and face for many of you. Moving on, Ulrich is joining us from Germany tonight. Welcome, Ulrich. He is a professor of systematic theology at the University of Heidelberg in Germany, and he specializes in ecumenical theology and theology related to economy. He's a co-founder and honorary chair of the Kairos Europe Group, which is an ecumenical grassroots network striving for peace and justice. And he's also been, over the years since 1983, an advisor to the World Council of Churches in a variety of different contexts. So we're really privileged to have two excellent speakers here again tonight. We are going to be looking to both of them very shortly to give us a presentation each, which will last around half an hour. And then we'll be moving into our question and answer session. Just some brief housekeeping, as we do at the beginning of all of these calls. First of all, please stay on mute, particularly when the speakers are doing their thing. It avoids all that background noise and distraction. If you'd like to ask a question in the Q&A, please can I ask you to use the raise your hand function on Zoom, and if you're struggling to find that, just drop me a note in the chat so that I can call on you and make sure we include you. We are recording this session, only the speaker part, and at the end of that we'll stop, and that's for anybody who wants to catch up on YouTube and use this with their Lent group in the week. The only other thing to say is that at the end of the question and answer session, if you're running your own discussion group as a Lent group this time, please do feel free to leave the call and go ahead with your Lent groups. And the rest of us can stay online to share in the recommended action and the prayer for the week. Hopefully, I'm not going to have the internet issues that I had last time. But if I do have any problems, the wonderful Jenny is online and co-hosting, so she will be able to guide you through. But hopefully, we're all sorted this time. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over first, I believe, to Ulrich, who is going to be our initial speaker for the first 15 minutes. It's wonderful. Ulrich, over to you when you're ready. And you'll just need to unmute yourself, Ulrich.
Okay, thank you very much. I feel very honored, and it's a great joy to be with you in this fantastic series of seminars, and particularly also together with Mark, and also seeing other names on the list, which I very much appreciate as colleagues in this struggle. Now, is it true that you cannot follow the gospel and support the oppression of the Palestinian people? This radical question can best be understood against the background of certain church historic situations. It was quite normally, I mean, you wouldn't have those kind of statements, absolute statements of truth. But it was quite a great challenge when in the 20th century, faithful Christians in Nazi Germany discovered that they were facing a situation of absolute evil, and also facing so-called church people, German Christians, who would go along with the Nazi. And so faithful Christians formed the Confessing Church and gathered for a synod in Barmen and produced the Barmen Theological Declaration as a basis for their struggle. And they said, alone Christ against one empire, one people, one Führer, leader. Huh? So 1 year earlier, Dietrich Bonhoeffer already had the stage by proclaiming that apostasy of German Christians had put the churches in status confessionis. That is a requirement to make an unambiguous decision. And he did this in his article, The Church and the Jewish Question, in 1933, putting two conditions for the status confessionis at that time. First, when a state deprives one group in society of their fundamental rights, at that time the Jews, because by doing so, that state destroys itself in its God-given mandate. And the second condition for a clear confession is when the state interferes in fundamental matters of faith, so transgressing its limits. The second time in the 20th century, this challenge for a clear decision happened in relation to apartheid in South Africa, and I do not need to talk about that because the two fantastic speakers last time, Brian Brown and Alan Bussack, talked about that. The third time, it was the nuclear armament in the 1980s, which challenged the Reformed Church in Germany to say no without a yes to the production, deployment, and use of weapons of mass destructions. And then in the 1990s, it was the World Alliance of Reformed Churches calling for a process of recognition, education, and confession, processus confessionis, with regard to economic injustice and ecological destruction. And the result was that the Lutheran World Federation, World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and World Council of Churches in their assemblies from 2003 to 2013 officially rejected imperial capitalism as not reconcilable with a Christian faith. Shortly after this, as you know, Pope Francis followed that line with his pastoral letter, Evangelii Gaudium, stating that this economy kills and therefore no to the lordship of finance, etc. It is in this tradition of necessary, clear confession that the cry for hope places the situation in Israel-Palestine by saying you cannot follow the gospel and to support the oppression of the Palestinian people. It says this on the basis exactly of the two arguments of Bonhoeffer, the two conditions. First, the deprivation of rights of one group of people, and second, the misuse of the Bible to justify the unjust system of Christian Zionism. Now, last time you have talked about the situation that exactly this kind of clear confession is completely coherent with the biblical witness, because apartheid is not only a crime legally and grave injustice politically, but it contradicts our biblical faith. It offends God, the creator of one humanity. it despises God, the liberator, and also it offends God, the Spirit inspiring the prophets for justice, Jesus for the kingdom of God, the Apostle Paul saying that the Messiah overcomes all separations and power hierarchies between Jews and other peoples, rich and poor, men and women. Galatians 26-28. The Pentecost community of disciples shares everything. And so it's quite clear that all the biblical texts furnish overwhelming evidence that apartheid is the very antithesis of our faith. It is a sin, and the justification of it is a heresy. Now, how can we, in the different social forms of our churches, respond to this clear call of our suffering and resisting Palestinian brothers and sisters, and the Bible also in this tradition of this faithful discipleship? It is extremely important to understand what status confessionis and the connected process means. It does not mean that you say that or that person or that church does not belong to the Church of Christ. That is not the starting point, but together, Christians, faithful Christians, say we feel compelled to confess Jesus Christ in this situation in the following way. Please join us. And Bonhoeffer in that context distinguishes the false church from the erring church. The false church supports the persecutor of the true church, but the erring church must be involved in strong communication. And therefore, the first response to our title question is exactly what Cry of Hope says. We call upon all Christians and churches at congregational, denominational, national, and global ecumenical levels to engage in a process of study and reflection and confession concerning the historic and systemic deprivation of the rights of the Palestinian people and the use of the Bible by many to justify and support this oppression, end of quote. At all levels, that is absolutely important. Congregational level, the brothers and sisters in Palestine say, come and see the reality. Also against those threats from people who call it anti-Semitic when you see the reality and also criticize it. But also you can invite Palestinian speakers or critical Jewish speakers who tell you about the story and give about the situation and give witness to it. You also can then at district and regional level then organize synodical processes and decisions and actions. And there we can, as Germans, learn from the UK. You know that URC, the Methodists and Carlite Anglican Synod have already responded, much more than German churches have responded. And of course, you know, the outstanding example is the United Church of Christ in the USA. They have formulated a clear confession shaped according to the Barman Declaration. We affirm, we reject in 6 points. Fantastic. And clearly saying who supports that kind of oppression, that is a denial, fundamental denial of the gospel. So, and also rejecting the oppression must be stated against Christian Zionism, etc. But there is a very important other dimension, and that is concrete action. And they are asking for cessation of US military aid until such time as Israel complies with human rights and with international law. So in particularly, the British and also the Germans have particular historical responsibility for this. I don't need to tell you about how the British Empire gave the colonial framework for the Nakba. You know that I don't need to repeat that. And of course, in the German situation, everybody knows that this kind of way of constituting the state, nobody is challenging the UN, the state of Israel on the basis of international law, but it was the kind of way that this was established by ethnic cleansing, etc. First 6 months, even under English mandate, British mandate. And so this, that is historic responsibility, the British and the Germans particularly. But there is also an actual responsibility of the West, particularly the United States, the European Union, and also the UK now after the exit. Because we finance and military and politically support the occupation, only rhetorically rejecting it. Look at these, only at the United States with $3.8 billion every year for military aid without any condition. And so the same thing with Germany, the submarines, etc. Tax money is used to finance oppression in Israel, Palestine, and tax money of the West. Now, so the West has the key to end the apartheid system in Israel, Palestine, because this means there should be a primary task of the churches in the West who faithfully confess Christ in this situation to join the forces in society, challenging the governments to link any cooperation with the state of Israel to the fulfillment of human rights and international law. And they have a strong argument. Also, Israel has only a future if it is a common future for both people in justice and equality. Finally, international level of this process. You know that the World Council of Churches, WCC, will have its assembly in Germany, Karlsruhe, in September this year. We hope that many delegates, yes, many delegates also from the UK, support strong resolutions for justice and liberation in Palestine. Please approach your delegates in your churches and plead with them to be informed and ready to stand with the suffering and resisting Palestinian brothers and sisters. If you give us the mail addresses of your delegates via Charlotte, for instance, we can also inform them about what Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice is doing. Let me close with the last words of late Archbishop Tutu's letter to the German churches. Neutrality must not be an option, for it always favors the oppressors. Always. Please join the ecumenical Kairos movement and publicly in solidarity demand freedom for Palestine so that Israel can also be free, end of quote. So this is the response to the question, is it true that you cannot follow the gospel and support the oppression of the Palestinian people? Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. That was wonderful and beautifully clear, which I'm very pleased about. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Mark now for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back to you, Ulrich, as well for our question and answer session. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte. And it is really lovely to be with you today to see some familiar faces, and to be with friends, and especially to be with my friend and colleague and teacher, Ulrich. That's a privilege. And just to say that I wish we could all be here together in person, but it's a wonderful, wonderful program that you're doing. My hat is off to you, Charlotte, and to all of your colleagues in the UK for the wonderful, wonderful work that you're doing. And we will come back to that. Oh, did I say friends in the UK and Ireland? Not to forget. Hello, John, and others. Let me start with a story. In 2009, I was privileged to be in Bethlehem for the launch of the Kairos Palestine document, which I know you have all read and absorbed and are fully conversant in at this point. And It was a wonderful ecumenical international gathering in Bethlehem to launch this prophetic document. And I was privileged to be there to participate. I found myself one evening sitting in a hotel bar in Bethlehem, and I was sitting with a young man named appropriately Christian. He was a young German man who worked for the World Council of Churches. He sat in Geneva. And we were talking about this, and he said, you know, this is a terrific document, but I can't bring it back home to Germany. I can't bring it to my churches in Germany. So I naively asked him, why was that? He said, because it mentions the boycott, and you have to understand that we Germans, we're very sensitive about this idea of boycotting Jews and taking a stand against an entire people, and I can't do it. And I was beginning of finding my voice in this endeavor that I've become involved in. And I said, Christian, of course I understand your feelings, but you need to understand how much you are hurting me as a Jew in making the statement and in foregrounding your own feelings, understandable feelings, as a German and as a Christian. Because this feeling, as you know well, is not only held by German Christians, it's held by Western Christians and actually Christians all over the world about this idea of what it means to take a stand for the Palestinian people, if it means supposedly going up against the Jewish people. I said, do you understand that you are continuing to reinforce me as a Jew in my own victimhood and reinforcing your own identity as a criminal? You know, we all have to move on from this. I beg you, take this document back to your nation and to your people and to your churches. It's the most loving thing that you can do, not only for the Palestinians, but my God, for the Jewish people, because we are in a big mess. He said, I can't. And that really was the beginning in some ways of the ministry that I've undertaken here, and which Ulrich and I are going to be talking about today. You know, you did hear from the experts on apartheid. I mean, the experts there, the Palestinians, of course, but you heard from Brian and you heard from Alan about South Africa. And really, apartheid itself raises the core, the fundamental issues of the gospel. It is racism. And as such, it calls to the church, as Ulrich has pointed out, to take a stand. There can be no ambiguity, no hesitation, no middle ground. There is no other story. There is no other narrative. Jesus in the Gospel of John didn't say, can we remodel this temple? Can we make it a kinder, gentler piece of empire, tax the people to death? Jesus didn't get the money changers together in the courtyard of the temple and say, can we give you a better financial system, so maybe give the poor a break? No, Jesus did neither. He said, destroy this temple, bring it down. And he drove the money changers out in an attempt to cleanse the temple, the people, the whole institution, the system of the evil that had taken over. He took sides. And when he asks the question, who is your neighbor? He's not asking for gray areas. He's saying, who is it? It's the oppressed, it's the poor, right? I mean, in the 1980s, the world did not accept the Pretoria government's offers of reform, of Bantustans, of bringing blacks into the legislature, even though they didn't have a full vote, all to make apartheid more acceptable. The World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982 did not say to the offending churches in South Africa that were practicing apartheid, separation of black and white, to take communion. Come back to us with a plan to integrate. Come back to us with a compromise that will make everyone feel better. It suspended those churches until they brought themselves back into the body of Christ by stopping the policy of apartheid in their own midst. In 1985, Kairos, South Africa document written by churches, I hope you've read it, I hope it's on the curriculum, they called for the downfall of the government. They said, as churches, we cannot collaborate with this anymore. This government must be replaced because we can't live with it anymore. So, and today we don't hesitate when it comes to racism in our backyards, in our cities, in our governments. We don't hesitate when we see persecution and genocide practiced by China or by India or other places in the world. We don't hesitate to call colonialism or invasion or occupation and land theft by a greater power and a lesser power, as is happening now in Europe. We don't hesitate to call it what it is. So why is it different for Israel's apartheid? Why do we refuse to call Zionism by its name? Racism, colonialism, a justification, ideological and theological, for genocide, ethnic cleansing, the erasure, the attempted erasure of a culture. And this has to do with the history of the Jewish people and of the church. The history between Judaism and Christianity, which is a sad history, we know it well, not only because of the suffering that it's caused for the Jews, because of what it has meant for the church in losing track of Jesus and the Gospels over the centuries. In the aftermath of World War II, the Christian world stood before the still smoldering ovens of the Nazi death camps and said, what have we done? And they embarked on a program to cleanse Christianity of its anti-Judaism and to rebuild a relationship with the Jewish people and to reconcile with the Jewish people, to repent for the sin of anti-Semitism. And this set into motion a whole process that we're still living with today, because the issue of Zionism and what Israel is today has brought this to the fore. I mean, for Jews, in the aftermath of World War II and the near genocide of all of the Jews of Europe, and the creation of the state of Israel, we, as the Jewish people, reverted to an embrace of ethnic nationalism, of particularity writ large, the merger of peoplehood and religious identity with nationalism, a bad thing. And we embraced what Walter Wink, the liberation theologian, called the myth of redemptive violence. Zionism has hijacked our faith and our community, our values, our relationship with humankind. It has sickened us as an international religious community, as well as done horrible damage to the people of Israel, the Jewish citizens of Israel. People say, well, if you're pro-Palestine, you must be anti-Israel. And I say, don't put me in that box. But if you want to put me in a box, call me pro-Israel, because it's my family, my cousins, my co-religionists who are suffering, as the white South Africans did, under the poison of apartheid, as my own American people have suffered under the poison of our own racist society. And for Christians, it's meant turning your back on Pentecost. It's meant turning your back on Jesus's fundamental message, which is embodied in Matthew 25, as Ulrich pointed out, and in the message of Pentecost, which is, this is no longer for one tribe or one people. We don't worship God on one mountain, in one house. This is for everyone. That is the Christian message. And now, because of guilt and shame about anti-Semitism and church anti-Semitism, the church institutionally and Christians in the pews and their pastors still, by and large, have embraced the sin of ethnic nationalism, genocide, and ethnic cleansing on the part of the Jewish people, supported by not only Jewish theology, but most of all, by Christian Zionism. Let me tell you another quick story and I'll stop. I think it must have been about 10 years ago. I was in South Africa. The South African Council of Churches had organized a one-day seminar for members of the churches, clergy, lay people, church leaders, theologians in Johannesburg. And I was privileged to be there and to co-present with South African colleagues, as well as via Zoom, a wonderful theologian, Johanna Catanacho from Bethlehem, from the Bethlehem Bible College. And about 50 people turned up, Black, white, ecumenical, all denominations, theologically conservative, theologically liberal and progressive. And in the morning, we presented to them, what's the situation in Palestine today? People from the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program talked about the denial of human rights systemic denial of human rights in Palestine. We talked about theology. I talked about my own Jewish journey from Zionist to anti-Zionist. And in the afternoon, we broke up into small groups, and I was sitting in a small group, and one of the people in that group was a Methodist bishop. Now, this was a Methodist in South Africa, and Africa doesn't mean the same as Methodist in the UK. Theologically, it's very conservative, very, very kind of Bible-based, the inerrant word of God. And is a Black man, a large man, with the purple shirt and a cross, like, you know, as big as a door, or, you know, hanging on his chest. And he turned to me and he said, "Thank you. You have turned us around. Now we understand," because for a Black person in South Africa, it takes about 5 minutes to understand what's going on there when you explain it to them, what apartheid is. And he said, "You've turned us around." And then he said something very interesting. He said, "We have to go back and reread our Bibles." He got it. He understood that this is not only a political and human rights issue, this is a theological battleground. It's the Bible that we have to go back to and reread, because the Bible is telling us something very different. It's telling us Israel equals the Jewish people. The return to Zion today is a fulfillment of biblical promises, and we have to accept this and we have to support it. And he said, "I got to go back and take another look at this." I mean, it's wonderful. And then he turned to his secretary, a smaller man sitting next to him, and he said something equally, I think, even more important. And this is the point that I want to make. He said, "How do we take this back to our people in our church? Because they will accuse us of going against the inerrant word of God and of betraying the Bible." And this is our challenge today, as you know, and this is what this whole Lent series is about. And this is what Cry for Help is about. So there are three things we need to do. Well, two things we need to do. We need to grapple with theology. This is the barrier. This is why the world cannot say to Israel, "Thou dost evil." This is apartheid. It is racism. We cannot support it, not politically, not theologically. We have to go to our church leaders and say, "Stop." We have to go to our governments and say, "Stop." We have to go back and reread our Bibles. And second, and I say this to you Christians, you've got to pick up this cross of being called the worst name that you can be called, which is anti-Semitic. Today, anti-Semitism, which is real and a sin and is racism, has been distorted, twisted, and weaponized by those who want to defend Israel and excuse Israel and the Jewish people for their crimes today through the state of Israel. You know about you've seen this battleground happening in the public arena between the heads of the Jewish community attacking the churches, attacking your politicians. It's being debated in Parliament, just like it's being debated in the halls of Congress, which I think is a wonderful thing. That's finally, it's out in the open. And you need to be unapologetically Christian and say, you know, "I'm sorry, my Jewish sisters and brothers, if this threatens you and it makes you afraid. We understand that, but we must put our own house in order." And if you need to understand that we Jews have to have our own internal conversation, it's a critical family discussion that we're having right now. We have to do that. But you cannot let yourselves get involved in that. You cannot let yourselves be intimidated by that or run by that. You must put your whole house in order. And I look forward to talking with you more about that in the discussion period. The last word I want to say is, And Ulrich has talked about that in terms of his own context in Germany, and we see that certainly in the UK and in America and everywhere. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, during his own struggle, came up with the whole concept of the church struggle. And he said, the only true church, not the false church, but the true church, is a struggling church, is a church that in every generation, in every historical period, struggles with what history is handing it, which is the need to look down in the ditch, see who is naked, struggling, and abandoned there, and do something about it, and not walk on like Jesus's foil, the Pharisee, walked on. Not walk on like the Roman soldiers, symbolizing the governments of the world looking to take care of their own interests, walk on. In this case, you have to pick up a cross, which is that you will not be thanked for it. You will be cursed for it. And I can't tell you what to do, but I think you know what I'm saying. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. If you're listening online on Catch Up, that's going to be the end of our video session for today. We hope that Mark and Ulrich have given you a really good insight into the issues, and that you can then use that to discuss in your Lent groups. And we hope to see you back again next week as well. So I'm just going to